My name is John Dorney. I've been the organiser for the other talks. I'm actually going to be giving the talk tonight. Briefly about my background, I'm the editor of the irishstory.com website on Irish history, the independent historian. I have a book, an overview of the Irish Revolution called The Peace After the Final Battle, which is coming out hopefully at the end of this month. New Islands Press, and tell you more than I can. We're going to talk tonight about the Irish Civil War. The Irish Civil War is one of the most important events in 20th century Ireland. It's also one of the least talked about. And there's an obvious reason for that, which is you can get from the title of this lecture, Brother Against Brother. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about the personal relationships of the Civil War, but if you bear in mind before I start that a family like the McNeill family, Owen McNeill was one of the founders of the Gaelic League. He was one of the founders of the Irish Volunteers in 1914. Famously tried to call off the Easter Rising. Became a minister in the first Free State government that was founded under the treaty. One of his sons was in the National or Free State Army. Another son, Brian, was in the Anti-Treaty IRA in Sligo. And his son Brian was killed fighting against the treaty, which made McNeill a minister in the Free State government. Bear in mind also the Hales family of Cork. Sean Hales, TD from County Cork, was assassinated in December 1922. His brother Tom was fighting on the other side in County Cork in the Anti-Treaty IRA. So I think that illustrates the personal bitterness and the reason why the Civil War is a forgotten memory and a forgotten wound, I think, to 20th century Ireland. But what I'm going to try to do today is I'm going to try to give an overview of the Civil War, try to make it make some sense. Because a lot of the violence in the Civil War, when you first look at it, seems kind of chaotic. There's the guerrilla war. There's also agrarian violence. This means people trying to take land. There's labour disputes, which often turn very violent. And I'm going to try to explain how all of this fits together, okay? So, I'm going to start with talking about the state. The theory is only going to last for a minute, so stay with me. The Civil War was basically about the founding of the Irish Free State and setting up the Irish Free State. But what is a state? Okay, so my first quote is from my first two quotes are from German philosophers, funnily enough. One is from Friedrich Engels, who was the co-thinker of Karl Marx, of course, co-wrote the Communist Manifesto. This won't be a communist lecture, but Friedrich Engels wrote, "The state is the admission that this society has become entangled in an insoluble contradiction with itself. It has built irreconcilable antagonisms which it is powerless to dispel. It became necessary to have a power seemingly standing above society that would alleviate the conflict, keep it within the bounds of order. This public power," this is the important bit, "this public power exists in every state. It consists not merely of armed men, but also of material agents, prisons, and institutions of coercion." Okay? So the important part is the last part, that the state, the most important part of the state is its ability to impose law, right? Its armed force, its prisons, its instruments of coercion. Okay? Second quote is from Max Weber. Now Max Weber was the father of sociology. Okay? He gave this talk in 1918, at the time when Germany was also slipping into a kind of civil war, actually. The state is that human community that successfully claims the monopoly of legitimate force, this is important, in a given territory. The state is considered the sole source of the right to use violence. Now, what Max Weber is saying here is two important things. Number one, a state has to be the main source, the main right to use violence. There can't be anything stronger, or else the state can't impose its law. Now, this doesn't mean that the state is violent all the time, but the state has more power than anyone else, okay? And if this doesn't exist, if you think about this, there really can't be a state, because somebody who's stronger, who's better armed, can say, "I'm not following your law," okay? So when you're setting up a state, the monopoly of force is important. Now the second important thing that Weber is saying here is the monopoly of legitimate force, right? So this means not only that your state is stronger, okay, but that people believe it has the right to impose its law. But this is very important because in Ireland from 1919 to 1921, the British state lost some of its monopoly of force. This means that it could put down the IRA in 1919 to 21. It wasn't able to completely defeat it, but it was able basically to still rule. But it did lose its monopoly of legitimate force. People no longer accepted it, okay? So what's at stake in the Irish Civil War, I think there's two things. One is the monopoly of force. So the Irish state, the new Irish state, the Free State, is trying to impose its ability to administer law. And the second thing is it's trying to be accepted. It's trying to have itself accepted as the legitimate source of law. Okay, so two things. Now, how does this connect with Ireland? I think it connects with the third quote here. Kevin O'Higgins was the Minister for Home Affairs in the first Free State government. And he said of his position, "We had to meet force with force, and to deter men from taking action, which it enlarged and continued with smashed democratic institution here, we had to do this thing that was done this morning." The important part again is the last line. ultimately, all government is based on force. Now, what was this thing that we had to do this morning? The thing was executing extrajudicially, illegally, for leading members of the AntiTreaty IRA. Okay? So, the overview of the Irish Civil War, what I'm trying to argue is that the Irish Civil War, what's happening in the Irish Civil War is that the state is trying to impose, again, Weber's phrase, its monopoly of legitimate force. So two things, force and the legitimacy, both are important. Okay? So, how did we come to have a civil war in Ireland? The short answer is it was caused by the treaty. Okay? So, the Republican movement was split by the treaty. Now, what happened in the treaty? Now, before I get into the detail, there is a fallacy that's often repeated about this whole period in Ireland, which is that the treaty was no different to Home Rule, that the whole independence struggle, the violence, the deaths, was for nothing, because the treaty, the Anglo-Irish Treaty, was the same as Home Rule. Now, this is not true, okay? The Home Rule was a limited autonomy within the United Kingdom. It's something like Scotland has at the moment, not like it's going to get maybe if it goes for independence, but what it has, which is local government, okay? The Home Rule didn't have the three main attributes a state has to have. It couldn't collect its own taxes, it didn't have its own army, or it wouldn't have had its own army, and it didn't have its own police, okay? Now the treaty gave all these things to the Irish Free State, okay? It gave dominion status, the same as Canada and Australia, to the Irish Free State. So it meant that Ireland was effectively independent, or sorry, the 26 counties of Ireland, because there was also partition, of course. So what were the drawbacks of the treaty? The drawbacks were partition was confirmed. Now another misunderstanding that people have is that the treaty brought in partition. That's not true. As Kieran Glennon, who was down the back, talked about 2 weeks ago, partition was brought in 1920 in the Government of Ireland Act. Okay? What the treaty did was it confirmed partition. In theory, it gave Northern Ireland, which already existed, during the day to see if they wanted to come into the Free State. Now, no one expected them to do this, and no one, more importantly, perhaps, was in a position to force them to do this because the Northern Ireland government already had its own army, as well as the British Army. They had the Ulster Special Constabulary, they had the region of 20,000 armed men. So, but partition was confirmed. The other downsides, there was unsure control over foreign affairs. Now, we know, going from what happened later, and what happened much later in the 1930s, that the Irish state eventually got control over its foreign affairs. This wasn't apparent in 1922. It wasn't clear that Ireland would have control over its foreign affairs. So this meant, remember, we're just after the First World War, this meant if there was another World War, would Ireland be involved? Not sure, okay? The third thing, where did sovereignty lie? Now this seems like a very academic point, but it is important, and I'm going to expand on this in a second. Did the sovereignty lie with Irish people or the British monarch? Why is this important? Because when you have a state, when you have a law, where does the authority come from? Does it come from the consent of the people, as the classical republican principle, not just in Ireland, but in all republics? Or does it come from the British monarch? And this caused so much trouble in this, the oath. Okay, now some people don't like calling it the oath, but this was inserted into the constitution of the Free State. All parliamentarians, all TDs would have to take this oath, okay? And how it goes is, I do solemnly swear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution of the Irish Free State, as by law established, and that I will be faithful to His Majesty King George V, his heirs and successors, by virtue of the common citizenship of Ireland with Great Britain and the membership of the British Commonwealth of Nations. Okay? Now, this was actually a compromise. Michael Collins based the first part apparently on his Irish Republican Brotherhood oath. And the second part is what the British wanted. Why is the oath so important? The oath is important symbolically because the British get to say by the oath that they didn't lose the war of independence. They're negotiating their way out, they're negotiating Irish self-government. It's basically a home rule writ large. The Irish are now, once they're satisfied, they're going to be loyal subjects. Okay? This is the way the British government has to sell it to their own public. Okay? So, this is a very explosive issue because the volunteers in the Irish Republican Army, the members of the Dáil and Sinn Féin, had taken an oath to uphold the Irish Republic. Now this is more so than Ireland today. This is a religious society. People believed if you swore an oath, it was a sacred bond and you couldn't break it. Okay, so this the oath is often people often say that oath is an abstraction. They're arguing over a form of words, which again was said, and it wasn't worth dying over. Well, perhaps, but there's two things I want to say about the oath. Number one, the oath represents something important, which is where does sovereignty lie? Does it lie with the Irish people, or does it lie with the British monarch? Number two, if the oath is not important, then why did the British insist that there had to be an oath? Okay. Pro-treaty reactions to the treaty. Now, the pro-treaty reaction is that the treaty is the will of the people. Okay? It's the best deal on offer. It's a stepping stone. This is Michael Collins' words. Michael Collins says famously, the treaty is not the freedom to which all nations aspire to, but it's freedom to achieve freedom. People like Owen McNeill, who I've mentioned already, Owen McNeill said, I dislike every part of the treaty, but basically it's the best deal on offer. Now, Arthur Griffith founded Sinn Féin back in 1905. Arthur Griffith was the founder of the Sinn Féin party. He was the founder of their policy of abstaining from the Dáil. Arthur Griffith was the only one who sort of defended the treaty on its merits. Arthur Griffith said, and I think there's a point, he said, we brought back the flag, we brought back an Irish army, we brought back control over the public finances. There are real concrete gains. He says, forget about the oath, forget about the abstract things. There are concrete things to be gained from the treaty. Now, however, I've talked about the importance of force when you set up a state. It's all very well having the best ideas, but who's going to enforce this treaty? Now, Michael Collins and Richard Mulcahy had been the heads of the IRA. Michael Collins, in theory, was Director of Intelligence. In reality, Michael Collins was really the boss of the IRA, partly through his control of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. Richard Mulcahy was the Chief of Staff of the IRA. So the leadership of the IRA was pro-treaty. Now, Collins' personal network is very important. Key IRA commanders, people like Owen Duffy in Monaghan, people like Sean McKeown in Longford, people like Michael Brennan in Clare. These people, and possibly most important of all, the Dublin Guard, which was formerly Collins' assassination unit, also the active service unit in Dublin, so really the combatants in the Dublin IRA. They were brought on board into the treaty because they were loyal to Collins. And the famous phrase at the time was, if it's good enough for Nick, it's good enough for me. Another strange thing, Kieran Daniel mentioned this the other week, the Belfast IRA were pro-treaty. Now isn't this strange? The treaty confirmed partition, the Belfast IRA were pro-treaty. I don't really have time to go into this today, but basically what Michael Collins told them was, the treaty is a temporary thing, Northern Ireland won't be viable, they're going to siege large parts of the border area, and we're going to take back the north within a few years. In the meantime, Collins was arming the Northern IRA, he was giving them aid, he was planning a northern offensive in early 1922, which didn't quite come off, but for all of these reasons, most of the Northern IRA, especially the Belfast IRA, was on the pro-treaty side, which seems strange, but there it is. The anti-treaty, the civil society reactions, before I get to the anti-treaty. Now, this graphic here, I'll talk a bit later more about the election, but this is to show the geographical spread. There is no doubt that there was a lot of public support for the treaty, because people didn't want violence to continue. They were sick and tired of the Black and Tans auxiliaries, in some cases sick of the IRA as well, but they were sick of violence. A lot of people, remember that there are responses in the Republican movement, ideological responses. A lot of ordinary people, apolitical people didn't have these responses, okay? So we see the east of the country. The light green, by the way, is pro-treaty, and the dark green is pro-treaty as well. The dark colour is anti-treaty. So what we see more or less is that the western seaboard, which is, with the exception of Cork, is the poorer part of the country, is anti-treaty. Nobody's really worked out the sociological dimensions of this yet, but basically this is true. The pro-treaty, the rich agricultural counties were strongly pro-treaty, okay? Now, just quickly some context in this. Now there's some people, I might argue, but some people still valued British connections. People argued they wanted free trade with Britain, which is something to bear in mind about all of this is that then as now, free trade with Britain was absolutely essential, especially to Irish farmers who made up most of the Irish economy at the time. But also the former Unionist community were very frightened of being cut off from the British Empire to which they felt allegiance. So you have to factor that in. Economic problems. There had been an economic crash in 1921. So you're talking about a time of mass unemployment. And a common pro-treaty argument is we can't be thinking about abstract ideas like the Republic. We have to settle down the country, we have to get a state up and running, we need law and order, and we need to get the economy back up and running, okay? Two very important things. The press was almost uniformly pro-treaty, okay? Now, it's difficult to imagine, because we live in such a multimedia age, how powerful the press was at the time. There was no radio, there was no TV, the press was exceptionally important. Now, I think it's very significant that in the only local paper which was anti-treaty was in Sligo, and Sligo was a county which voted solidly anti-treaty in the election of 1922. So the press played a very significant role. The Republicans argued that the press spread slander and lies about them, which to some extent is true. The government would later instruct the press to call the anti-treaty IRA terms like mutineers and irregulars. They weren't allowed to call them Republicans or the IRA because the government argued they were the real Republicans, they were the real IRA. The Catholic Church, again, this is a big topic, I don't really have time to go into this. The Catholic Church, again, was an extremely important shaper of public opinion at the time. And what's interesting about the Catholic Church's response is the Vatican itself, which took a big interest actually in Irish affairs, were kind of equivocal about the treaty. And their position was basically, you might accept the treaty or not, but certainly we don't want Irish Catholics fighting about it. The Catholic hierarchy was solidly pro-treaty, which is very interesting, to the extent that as the Civil War developed, they actually excommunicated anti-treaty fighters. Now, just a word on this. The anti-treatyites, for this reason, people sometimes say that they were anti-clerical and anti-religious. That's not true at all. Whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, that's not true at all. Most anti-treatyites were extremely religious, but they were prepared to defy the church over the treaty. But the Catholic Church basically said that it was a sin they issued a sermon saying it was a sin to oppose the treaty. Why? Because the treaty was the people's will, this line again, but also because Irishmen killing Irishmen is like fratricide, which again, I guess you can see. Now, but there's also core anti-treaty Republican support. So it's not like nobody is anti-treaty in the general population. There's roughly 30% hardcore Republican anti-treaty support. So what were the anti-treatyites? Okay, this is what we have here is an anti-treaty cartoon, and this is the way the Republicans saw it at the time. This is Ireland here in the Grove, the toga. Britain is whispering things in her ear. Michael Collins is holding a good point with the treaty, and the Catholic Church is whispering in Michael Collins' ear. So this is the way Republicans see things at the time. Edward de Valera, I'm not going to talk an awful lot about this because it's been done to death, I think, and it's been done to death more than it deserves. But at cabinet level, there's a certain amount of jealousy. Edward de Valera, when Collins brought the treaty back, de Valera's big problem was that Collins hadn't consulted them before. Okay, de Valera said to Collins, "We sent you over there to get an All-Ireland Republic, and you got neither this nor that. You didn't get an All-Ireland, and you didn't get a Republic." Now, the classic thing to say is, de Valera knew Collins couldn't get this and sent him over anyway, which is probably true. What de Valera said when Collins came back after on was he promoted external association. So Ireland would be in part of the British Commonwealth, but not part of it. I'm not exactly sure what he meant. I'm not sure anyone else was either. Cathal Brugha was famously very antagonistic personally to Michael Collins and Richard Mulcahy within the IRA. This is really more about personality. There's some of that. I think that's an overblown because the important thing, again I come back to my point. Why is there a civil war? There's a civil war because there's two rival armies in Ireland. It's the question of force is important. So the anti-treaty IRA, right? Unlike the country as a whole, roughly 80% of the IRA is anti-treaty. Okay. Now, why is this? I have some notes to try to explain why this is. And Cumann na Man, the women's auxiliary to the IRA, is almost entirely anti-treaty. 1 second. Here we go. Okay. So I want to read some reactions by IRA men to the treaty to try to explain their position, because it's often been misrepresented. Now, Ernie O'Malley says in his memoirs, Ernie O'Malley was the head of the IRA's first Southern Division, one of their most capable military commanders. He said, when he heard about the treaty, I cursed long and loud. So this is what we had fought and died for, what we had worn ourselves out for. Todd Andrews, who at the time was a mid-ranking, he's young but mid-ranking IRA officer, later on was important in Irish politics, but he said he learned of the oath of allegiance of the ports retained by the British. Oh, the British retained 3 naval bases, of course, in the treaty. The Irish state paying the pensions of the hated ORC, the Free State would have to pay the pensions of the ORC. And he said he thought there must be something wrong with the newspaper report. Collins would never have agreed to this. He said he felt sick with rage and disappointment. So, what I'm emphasizing is this is an emotional reaction, okay? Our friends didn't die for this. Now, there's a very good illustration of this from County Cavan, from the county council meetings. All over Ireland, this is debated in county councils, farmers' unions, trade unions, local halls. Up in County Cavan, there's a meeting on January the 1st. The treaty was signed in December 1922 and is voted through the Dáil January the 7th. Now, Mr. Fitzsimons, who was a pro-treaty Sinn Féin TD, proposed a motion to Cavan County Council saying, whilst it does not realise all the hopes of the Irish nation, it safeguards the best interests of the Gaelic nation. Also, there is no alternative. So this is the pro-treaty argument. Now, Mr. Boylan, who is a Sinn Féin, I said a TD, a Sinn Féin councillor, both of them Sinn Féin councillors, one pro-treaty, one anti-treaty. Now, the anti-treaty line is very simple. There's nothing complicated about it. Mr. Boylan replies, as Republicans, we do not approve of the treaty. Mr. Fitzsimons says, I am as convinced a Republican today as at any time over the past 4 or 5 years. The treaty is not a final settlement. I swore an oath to the Irish Republic, but I have no qualms about transferring that allegiance to the Irish Free State. Now, Mr. Boylan says, we were elected as Republicans, and that is all. At the farmers' meeting in County Cavan, Thomas Smith, another pro-treaty Sinn Féin member, argues about freedom to achieve freedom, quoting Collins. Now, Michael Sheridan gets up. Michael Sheridan was an IRA member, he was a Sinn Féin member. His brother Sean Sheridan had been killed in January 1920. His commanding officer, Paul Gallagher, had sent him to disarm a local RIC men who were guarding a local fair. Actually, what happened was Gallagher told him not to kill the RIC, to take their guns and not kill them. Now, Galligan was probably naive because when they arrived, the RIC drew their guns, there was a gun battle. So Michael Sheridan's brother was killed, his house was burned down, his family were threatened. Which, by the way, is the nitty-gritty of the word, and this is what happened. Now, but Michael Sheridan, whose brother was killed, his house was burned down, said, "Freedom was won by a sacrifice of lives. John Redmond could have had this in 1914. The treaty is not the freedom of Pearse and Tone, who the blood of Irishmen has been shed to redeem the soul of Ireland." Now, a heckler from the crowd shouted, "Are you going to shed it?" And Mr. Sheridan and Michael Sheridan said, "That's hardly fair. My family were prepared to shed blood and did shed it. The only sacrifice in Cavan, and I'm not ashamed of it." And the chairman got up and he said, you know, the heckler didn't know. So, but this is the kind of reaction you're talking about. My brother was killed for the Republic. He wasn't killed for the Free State. He wasn't killed to take an oath to the British Queen. Again, I stress, it's an emotional reaction, okay? The working out comes later. Now, Michael Sheridan speaks a couple of days later again in Cavan. He argues about the threat of force. So the British did, and this is another part of the treaty, the British did say you can have the treaty or more war, right? So there is a threat of force. There is also the British garrison in Ireland. In fact, there are 6,000 British troops in Ireland until 1922. So the threat of British force is always there. Now, Sheridan says at this meeting, the threat of force is not a good argument, and anyway, it's a mere bluff. But what he says next is very interesting, I think. "I'm not a doctrinaire Republican," he says. De Valera said this too, actually. "I'm not a doctrinaire Republican. Strictly speaking, I'm not saying what form of government Ireland should have, but I implicitly believe in complete and absolute independence from England." Okay? So, the anti-treaty position is not very complicated, right? What they're saying, when it comes down to it, and I'm talking not here about the people like Eamon de Valera, who did argue about things like Republican liberty and stuff like that, and Erskine Childers. The average IRA fighter on the ground is arguing stuff like this: "I took an oath to uphold the Republic, right? Our friends died for the Republic, and we're going to uphold the Republic no matter what you say." So, this brings us to the argument. Okay, the Dáil votes for the treaty in January 7th, 64 in favour, 54 against. Eamon de Valera resigns from the provisional government, but the provisional government is set up by Collins and Arthur Griffith in the Mansion House here. But again, they don't have any monopoly on force. They don't have police, they don't have an army because most of the IRA is against the treaty, and there's a hostile armed opposition. So really they have no state. In theory, there's supposed to be a government there for a year, it's supposed to set up the Free State, but as yet, this is mere words, okay? Now, the anti-treaty IRA disavowed the authority of the Dáil in April 1922 and put it in their own executive, okay? So, again, this is the arguments that rage over the Civil War. I'm not trying to take either side here, I'm trying to explain, okay, why people did what they did. They disavowed the authority of the Dáil. Now, there's another good quote here, which I think illustrates this. Joseph O'Connor, who's the commander of the IRA in Dublin's 3rd Battalion, said, "I felt it was wrong to accept any settlement with England for less than the absolute freedom of our whole country. Now that the Dáil had accepted the new position, I deemed that they had exceeded their powers, and it was my duty to continue striving until England withdrew all her forces." Now, I think this is anti-democratic behaviour, but I'm very wary of the notion that the anti-treaty IRA are some kind of proto-fascist, because if you look around Europe at the time, there are a lot of actual fascists, okay? Mussolini is marching Rome in 1922. Hitler is attempting the beer hall putsch, I think the previous year. There are all kinds of authoritarian right-wing movements who are not shy about saying we want a dictatorship. Now, the anti-treaty side never say anything like this, okay? There's one quote from Rory O'Connor. Rory O'Connor leads a hardline faction of the anti-treaty IRA, which occupies the Four Courts, which, as you'll know, is close to here, the centre of the Irish legal establishment. And there's a quote from a journalist says, "Well, are we going to have a military dictatorship? You won't obey the government of the Dáil. Is the IRA going to be the government?" And he says, "Well, you can take it that way if you want." Okay? And that's the closest anybody comes to ever saying we're going to have a dictatorship in Ireland. So I'm wary of this argument. But the fact is that the IRA says the civilian government, such as it is, again, it's not much of a government yet, doesn't have the authority. We have the authority. We're going to uphold the Republic, and we're not going to allow you to give the Republic away. Okay? Now, De Valera's role, again, I argue in this whole period is kind of overstated, because De Valera is not he's not the driving force here. The driving force is the IRA. What De Valera does, though, is he gives them legitimacy, because De Valera sides with the IRA against the government. De Valera famously and infamously makes this tour through the south of Ireland, and in Tipperary, I think, if I'm not mistaken, someone correct me on that, he makes this speech, an infamous speech. If the treaty were accepted, it may be necessary to wade through Irish blood, to wade through the blood of some of the members of this government. Which obviously is not a helpful thing to say, okay? But, again, what I argue is that De Valera is not the driving force here. The driving force is the IRA. Now, I think a better summing up of the Republican position, or the anti-treaty position, this is Ernie O'Malley again. If you give the people a good, strong lead, they will follow. So it's an elitist position in some ways. but I'm wary of this idea that it's some sort of fascist or otherwise takeover. So the IRA had no plan for an authoritarian takeover. And the other point I want to make is, I'm going to emphasize this as much as I can. Militarism is a feature of both sides. Now, I'm going to come back to this because I think this is important. I'll be coming back to this later in the talk. The pro-treaty IRA, which is the minority of the IRA, but which goes on to form the National Army, or the Army of the Free State, has at its core people, hardcore Republican militarists, in the sense that they've been guerrilla fighters. They were as committed to armed struggle as the anti-treaty side. They chose the pro-treaty side mostly out of loyalty to Michael Collins, okay? But they were equally wedded to the idea that the army is the most important institution in the country. The army has the right to determine the future of the nation, okay? They're also, the pro-treaty IRA, who are at the core of the National Army, are also wedded to the idea that following legality, following the law, isn't necessarily something we have to always do. Armies have to win wars, they don't follow laws. So that's going to be important. Okay. I'll try to move a bit quicker here, and by the way, this is some anti-treaty propaganda here. The will of the people. So the will of the people can be wrong sometimes, is what they're saying. If you would answer the will of the people in 1914, you would have gone to Flanders, you would have joined the British Army in the First World War. If you acted on the will of the people, you would have lynched Patrick Pearse because the people were against the Easter Rising. This is the kind of thing Republicans were arguing. So in 1916, the Republicans were right, even if the majority was against them, and we're still right today. The road to civil war. I'm going to try to do this as quickly as I can, because we had a lecture at the Truce last week. There's three armies in Ireland. There's the pro-treaty IRA, there's the anti-treaty IRA, there's the British Army, and there's another army in the north, effectively. There's the Ulster Special Constabulary. The British begin evacuating in early 1922. It starts in January, it picks up in March, April. There's competition over barracks. So the pro-treaty IRA try to occupy some barracks. The anti-treaty IRA occupies some barracks. There are fights over barracks. Here in Dublin, in April, there's a firefight over who would occupy Wellington Barracks, which is now Griffith College. Later on, it's Griffith Barracks. The Republican courts are no longer operating. Now, the Republican courts had tried to keep order during the War of Independence. The problem with that was the British shut them down. The Republican courts are no longer really operating, but there's nothing to replace them, because the old courts are basically defunct. And anyway, again, back to my point about force, there's no one to enforce the law. No one has a monopoly on legitimate force. Law and order breaks down in many places in Ireland. Ordinary crime rises, but also you have a lot, and this is again important, you have three armies, none of whom are under any kind of civil control. So the anti-treaty IRA is not being paid, but they are basically operating as full-time soldiers. So they have to, or they did, commandeer or take goods from civilians, okay? People are manning checkpoints, civilians get shot because people think that they're a threat, but there's nobody to put a check on any of these militaries, including, by the way, the British military, which because they're evacuating, isn't under an awful lot of control either. Is civil war inevitable? Now, I think probably yes, okay? Why? Because you have two rival armies in Ireland, about three, but the British are about to leave, most of them. You can't have a state with two rival armies, it simply won't work, okay? 1922 election. Now, Collins tried, and I must give credit to him here, because he really did try to heal this breach. He organised a pact with them in De Valera, and Liam Lynch is the IRA Chief of Staff. The compromise, basically, Collins' idea was the compromise was basically two things. It was a political compromise, so the Free State Constitution would be Republican. It wouldn't mention the British monarch, okay? Now, the British sabotaged this. The British insisted there had to be an oath, as for reasons I've already gone into. Collins organised a pact with them in De Valera, so the pro and anti-treaty factions of Sinn Féin, actually De Valera founded a party called Common Republic, but anyway, the pro and anti-treaty sides of Sinn Féin would jointly campaign in the 1922 election, the first Free State election. This didn't happen because the Free State Constitution was torpedoed, or Collins' version of it rather, was torpedoed by the British. Winston Churchill said, if there is a republic, by which he means, here what he means is, Free State Constitution, which doesn't have an oath, which doesn't include loyalty to the British monarch, then we will reoccupy Dublin, and then we will reoccupy the rest of Ireland. Okay, so the British threat of force is there. This undermines the pact. The other thing Collins tries to do is the IRA Northern Offensive. Now, Kieran has gone into this. I won't go into this in depth, but Collins and Lynch tried to unite both factions of the IRA to attack the north, to attack Northern Ireland. This didn't really come off. It was a failure, and actually it deepened the bitterness between the two. But there's some very strange things happened. The IRA garrison, can we turn off our phones, please, folks? The IRA garrison in the forecourts handed over their weapon to the Free State Army, the National Army. The National Army gave them replacement weapons, and the guns they handed over were sent to the north. Some very strange things happened in this period for people who were occasionally shooting at each other even then. Now, the 1922 election was the pact. They were supposed not to be rivals, so they could preserve unity. That didn't happen, basically because of British pressure. Now, people argue if you can really tell the support for the treaty because of this pact, which muddied the waters. People were not sure who was a pro-treaty and who was an anti-treaty candidate. However, basically, what it does show is that there's a pro-treaty majority, a substantial pro-treaty majority. And I'll have the figures here, which I will briefly tell you. Very, very roughly, the pro-treaty vote is about 40%. The anti-treaty vote is roughly 20%, and the rest, the Labour Party actually does very well. The Labour Party's position is, actually we're for a workers' republic, but we'll accept the treaty pragmatically for now. Also the Farmers' Party, which represented strong farmers, they did very well. But basically, still basic, and we have here pro-treaty Sinn Féin, anti-treaty Sinn Féin. We see anti-treaty Sinn Féin is a lot stronger in the west of Ireland. The Labour Party is strongest in the southeast, it's strongest at this time in agricultural labourers. Farmers' Party is strongest basically in rich agricultural areas, Golden Vale, and independence. Independence actually really means former unions most of the time. And there's one or two ex-Home Rule MPs as well. Now, the outbreak of civil war. It broke out a confluence, it was like the phrase a perfect storm. A lot of things happened at the same time, which sparked the outbreak of civil war, whether it was inevitable or not. But Collins' attempts at forging unity were finished by this point. Now, someone assassinated Henry Wilson. Henry Wilson is British Field Marshal in London. Okay, he had been the advisor to the Northern Ireland government, had failed to protect Catholics in the north. Several hundred of whom were being killed in early 1922. Someone assassinated him. Nobody is really sure who. Okay, Michael Collins may have ordered it. It may have been the London IRA doing it on their own bat. Now, one thing is sure: it was not the people in the Four Courts. It was not the anti-treaty IRA. Whether they wanted to, they didn't do it. But Winston Churchill and Lloyd George, especially Winston Churchill, was pushing events in London. He assumed that the Four Courts garrison, the anti-treaty IRA, had done it, and he ordered Collins, enough is enough. You must take back the Four Courts. You must act against the irregulars, the mutineers. Now, it puts Collins in a very difficult position. Now, but there's one more crisis which really tipped the balance. Henderson, Leo Henderson, is an anti-treaty IRA member. He is actually, what he's involved in doing is actually seizing money to buy guns to send to the north. But he was arrested. I'm not entirely sure why he was arrested then, because he's been doing what he's been doing for several months with the connivance of the provisional government. In retaliation, the Four Courts arrested Ginger O'Connell, who was a general in the National Army, and this is the final straw. So this is the Four Courts here. Crowds. This is one of the strange features actually of the fighting in the Irish Civil War. Crowds came to watch the fighting. We can see the river bank. The National Army guns were on the opposite side of the river. There was initially two. The British, by the way, the British lent artillery to the National Army. The National Army assaulted the Four Courts for 3 or 4 days. Eventually, they blew a hole in the side of it and they assaulted it. There were only 3 anti-treaty IRA volunteers killed in the Four Courts. There were something like 14 or 15 National Army soldiers killed in the attack. This basically forced people to choose sides. The rest of the Dublin IRA, with the exception again of Collins Squad, the Dublin Guard, occupied O'Connell Street. There's 5 more days of fighting before the provisional government, or the National Army, seizes Dublin. Okay, Liam Lynch. I want to stress this again because another misconception is Liam Lynch, the IRA Chief of Staff, often presented as a mindless fanatic, and so forth. Liam Lynch had been trying to forge unity for these months. It was after the outbreak of fighting in Dublin where he decided the anti-treaty IRA was going to fight the government. Why? Because the government was acting on behalf of the British. Okay. Now, there's discordant views. I want to stress as well. The two sides to this dispute saw this in two completely different ways. The pro-treaty arguments are upholding the will of the people against the mutineers and the irregulars. So not the IRA, the mutineers, the irregulars, criminals, wreckers. The legal government, which has been elected, and so again there is some truth in this, the legal government is asserting itself, and there's a call to arms. So I'll show you a poster in a second, but they compared this to the French Revolution, the rising of the people in defense of the free state. Okay? The pro-treaty argument is this. Now, the anti-treaty argument, it's not even an argument, it's like two people seeing entirely different things when they look at the same thing. The anti-treaty argument is the Free State has made a preemptive attack on the real Republicans, the true Republicans, at the bidding of the British. So basically the Free State's soldiers are basically just British soldiers in different uniform. Collins had made himself Commander-in-Chief and head of government, this is true. So they argued at the time Collins is a dictator. And historian John Regan has a series of articles about this, I won't go into it too much. There was no Dáil vote on the attack, and they would not call the Dáil. They did not actually call the Dáil until September 1922. Another argument there. So, but the anti-treaty, the Republican argument is this is a military, junta is the Spanish pronunciation, but a military dictatorship. So basically both sides accuse the other one of being a military dictatorship. Some of this is propaganda, some of this is really how people see things. Two quick Two quick things of rival propaganda. On the right, the call to arms. So again, this is the pro-treaty thing. The people are rising in defence of the Free State. On the other side, 7 steps towards the Republic. Now this is a satirical thing. Remember, Collins had argued that this is, and Owen Duffy said, the treaty is a step to the Republic, and they said, guns and orders from England, the raid on Patrick Pierce's mother's house, the arrest of Terence McSweeney. Terence McSweeney is the mayor of Cork who died on hunger strike in 1920. Firing on unarmed prisoners in Mountjoy Jail, that is true, that did happen. The suppression of Republican papers, the killing of Cathal Brugha. Cathal Brugha, of course, is killed on the last day of the fighting in Dublin. So what I'm stressing here is that there are two very discordant views, two totally opposite views of what's happening. And this explains, I think, how it can become so bitter. Briefly, the balance of forces. The anti-treaty side had the majority of the IRA, but not its leadership. Okay, so the anti-treaty IRA is really a disconnected series of militias around the country. They don't, although they do have a command structure, they're not really able to coordinate large amounts of people and move them around in a military way. The pro-treaty government, well, they have the backing of the British, which is very important. They have money and arms from the British. They also, though, have a command structure, so they are able to some extent to coordinate large groups of men. Liam Lynch, as I said, the IRA Chief of Staff, had little strategic grasp. Liam Lynch is 32. He had been a guerrilla commander, a very effective guerrilla commander, but before that he'd been a clerk in a hardware store. Okay, so it's not, he wasn't a trained soldier. Again, I think that's important. Now, it looks initially like the anti-treaty side has the advantage because they have, this is Richard Mulcahy's estimate. Richard Mulcahy is now, becomes, after Collins' death, becomes the Commander-in-Chief of the National Army. There are roughly 4,000 National Army soldiers, not many at the start, against roughly 15,000 anti-treaty IRA. So it looks like, and people have argued that the anti-treaty side could have overwhelmed the Free State at its inception. That's not really true. For one reason, the anti-treaty IRA had only about 6,000 rifles, okay? They had a handful of machine guns, 1 or 2 armoured cars which they took off the British. And they're in no position really to wage what we call a conventional war. The pro-treaty army, the National Army, by contrast, has all the arms they want from the British, and should they need them, there are 6,000 well-armed British soldiers with artillery, with aircraft, with tanks, with armoured cars in Dublin. There's a further garrison in the north, and the British say openly that they will intervene if the treaty settlement is in danger. So I argue that the Civil War as a military contest is no contest, because actually the balance of forces are stacked in favour of the pro-treaty army and the pro-treaty government. Civil War. But basically, at the start of the Civil War, the anti-treaty side controlled most of the south of Ireland. They controlled what they called the Munster Republic, a line running with Cork as its capital, with Limerick at its western point, with Waterford at its eastern point, and quite a string of towns in between, in around Kilkenny, Clonmel, to Tipperary, that kind of area. And the opening stage of the Civil War was basically the Free State, the National Army and the Free State, the provisional government, used artillery, which again they had got from the British. They rapidly raised an army. Many of their soldiers they recruited were veterans of the First World War. Some of whom may have joined for idealistic reasons, many of whom joined for a job, because as I said, there was mass unemployment. Now, I don't say this as a criticism, but a lot of people who joined the National Army were not necessarily politically motivated. Okay, they were soldiers, they needed work. Okay. Now, the other thing that the pro-treaty army had was they had a corps from the pro-treaty IRA, especially in the Dublin Guard, who were motivated fighters. And they actually, if you look at the nitty-gritty, did most of the hard fighting. The provisional government forces seized these cities. They seized Waterford, Limerick, Cork, Kerry. They broke through Kilkenny, Tipperary. There were very low casualties, but what you find actually is that the anti-treaty side suffered less because they're in defensive positions. When there was too much force used against them, they tended to retreat. Civilians suffered quite a bit. Free State soldiers suffered more than anti-treaty soldiers. But the important thing here is the IRA was defeated but not destroyed. They were driven from their fixed positions. Not many of them were killed though, really, and not that many of them were captured. So the result of this was guerrilla war. This is a checkpoint, by the way, in Cappoquin, County Waterford, of National Army soldiers. Liam Lynch abandoned fixed positions, called for a return to guerrilla tactics, which he said formally had made us invincible against the British. Now, this initially went very badly for the Free State. I'm going to give some examples which are hard to read actually in this format, and I have to turn away from you for 1 second. But okay, in County Tipperary, over a 3-week period from August 1922 until September 1922. Now remember, the Civil War breaks out at the very end of June, June 28th. There's a month, more or less, of conventional warfare, ending with the seizure of Cork City in the first week of August. Now, in a 3-week period in County Tipperary in August, late August and early September 1922, 20 Free State soldiers are killed in ambushes, okay, and more wounded, including a senior commandant, Frank Thornton, who was badly wounded. Now, if you think about that, this is a relatively small area. Also, all this happened more or less in North Tipperary. 20 soldiers killed in a week. Now, had that happened in Afghanistan, for example, in the recent war there, that would have been a major crisis for the British Army and also for British politicians. But this is in 1 week in one corner of the country. Now, Dundalk was seized by Frank Aiken and a column of the, what was the 5th Northern Division. Actually, Frank Aiken, incidentally, tried to stay neutral, but he was arrested by pro-treaty soldiers. He broke out of Dundalk jail, and then he seized Dundalk town, he seized the pro-treaty garrison there. But he seized the whole town. I mean, this would never have been possible fighting against the British, but it shows the weakness of the Free State government at this point. Kenmare is seized by the AntiTreaty IRA in September. Over 100 National Army soldiers were taken prisoner. There's 200 taken prisoner in Dundalk. Most of Connemara and Western Mayo passes out of the government control. So you basically have, again, the state has, the IRA is not able, the anti-treaty IRA rather, is not able to defeat the state, but they are able to make it impossible for the state to impose, again, what I call the monopoly of force. They're not able to impose law and order, they're not able to collect taxes, they can't get the state up and running. So what's going to happen? And also, again, very importantly, the two leading figures in the provisional government die in exactly this period. Arthur Griffith dies of a stroke. Michael Collins, as most of you will be aware, dies in 22nd of August 1922 in an ambush in West Cork. I'm not going to get into the ins and outs of an ambush, we can talk about that later. But basically, this removes the Commander-in-Chief of the National Army, its main driving force, Michael Collins, removes the main political leader, Arthur Griffith. Power passes to Richard Mulcahy. Again, Richard Mulcahy was a good deputy from a pro-treaty point of view, had been the head of the IRA before. W.T. Cosgrave assumes head of governance from Arthur Griffith. It's called the President of the Executive Council under the terminology at that time. Now, the Civil War rapidly got very bitter, okay? And the nature of guerrilla war is that the guerrillas can strike at a time of their choosing. The regular army soldiers are exposed, they're patrolling streets, they're guarding barracks, they can be hit as and when guerrillas tend to choose. So what you tend to see in this phase is that the regular soldiers, or the Free State soldiers, suffered more in this phase, okay? And the nature of guerrilla warfare, I think you see this in every guerrilla war, is there are reprisals, okay? Now some examples. These two guys in the picture are Alfred Cole and Sean Colley. They're members of the Fianna here in Dublin. Now they were assassinated in the same weekend as Michael Collins was killed, possibly in retaliation for him, possibly in retaliation for something else. There were 3 more Fianna boys, they were boys, 16, 17, abducted, arrested first of all by National Army soldiers, a National Army officer named Charles Sultan. In October 1922, they were taken to Clondalkin. They were first taken to the barracks for questioning. They were later found shot in the head in Clondalkin, a place called Quarryvale, if anyone knows that. In Kerry, this is one of many examples in Kerry, but one example is this man, Bertie Murphy, who was accused of having been involved in an ambush where a National Army officer had been killed. He was beaten and shot at a crossroads and just dumped off the lorry. Cork, another man, Timothy Kennefick, same story, very gruesome killing according to what the Republicans were telling each other, supposed to have been dragged behind a lorry. At Sligo, Brian McNeill, who I mentioned before, the son of Owen McNeill, who was who remember was a minister for the government, so his son was killed on the other side in Sligo, along with 6 others, most likely executed after surrendering because shot in the head at close range. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not arguing for one side or the other. I'm trying to explain here how the brutalization happens in a guerrilla war, and it certainly did happen in the Irish Civil War, despite the fact that these people, many of them, had been comrades a few months before. Okay. Now, there are some anti-treaty assassinations. I'll get onto this later. 2 I want to talk about just briefly are the Scartino O'Connor brothers in Kenmare. The dynamic of personal betrayal here is important. The Scartino O'Connor brothers were very rare in being IRA officers in Kerry who were for the treaty. And when the IRA took Kenmare, these 2 brothers were pulled out of their house. They were asleep at the time when they were shot. Okay, so it did happen on both sides. What you tend to find though is that the pro-treaty side did more assassinations, more reprisals. Why? Because they were hit more often in actual combat. That's my explanation. Now, there were a lot of personal vendettas, and this would go on. This would get worse as the conflict went on. To some extent, I think the violence has its own dynamic. It's not necessarily connected. By the time it gets to this stage, it's not necessarily connected to arguments about the treaty and sovereignty. It's about personal revenge. Okay. Now, but the Free State does get the upper hand because many anti-treaty fighters are arrested. Now, why is this? Brief word on this. Number 1, the Free State's intelligence is very good. Now, I've been looking at the papers from National Army Intelligence, which is in Colorado Barracks, and they had an informer in the Army Council of the IRA. They were being told what the policy of the executive of the IRA, the very head of the IRA, was. So they also had a lot of help, much more so than the British before them, from the general population. So something like 12,000 IRA members and also Common the Man members and supporters were arrested by the end of the war and interned. The Dublin IRA was crippled by what they call the bridges job. And what this means is the Dublin IRA tried to destroy the bridges around Dublin, to isolate Dublin by destroying the bridges, by blowing the railway bridges, and basically kind of dismantling with pickaxes the footbridges. Again, intelligence, the Free State knew about this, the National Army rather, knew about this in advance. In fact, it was a joint operation by National Army and British Army troops, something that's not often publicised, but they captured around 180 Republicans in Dublin, which might not sound a lot in terms of, say, 12,000. It is important in a guerrilla war. It's a hell of a lot, actually, in a guerrilla war. This is in one weekend. Their garrisons were established around the country gradually, very gradually. There are sweeps of the west and south where the anti-treaty guerrillas were strong. They broke up what this meant was, not in big battles, but they meant that the larger anti-treaty columns had to break up. They had to go on the run. They're reduced to groups of about 10. So their military capacity diminishes just because the Free State is basically flooding the country with troops. There's also a collapse of anti-treaty morale in many places, except in Cork and Kerry, especially in Kerry. Kerry is the stronghold for various reasons of anti-treaty resistance. But in many areas, by late 1922, the anti-treaty morale is beginning to collapse. They're beginning to say, why are we doing this? What are we trying to achieve? They're also starting to see that we're losing. And especially in Dublin, what you see, what anti-treaty volunteers tend to say is, people are against us. And not all the people were against them, I stress, but many of them were. And certainly enough of them were. There's also political incoherence. What are they trying to do? Eamon de Valera set up a shadow government in October 1922. What he said was to uphold the will of the Irish people until there was no external force. Okay, so his argument is that with the Free State, remember, the Free State are basically the British. The British are coercing the Irish people. So there's no democracy going on here, and the Republican government is in existence for the present. Okay, but it's not a particularly coherent argument because there is no Republican government. Okay, there are no Republican courts that are been against the British. There are no Republican police. There are only anti-treaty guerrillas. Only exists in their presence. Now, the Civil War's bitterest probably period, bitterest memory. Although in fact, one caveat before I get into this: most people who were killed in the Irish Civil War are killed in the summer and autumn of 1922. In other words, the majority of people in the Irish Civil War were actually killed in combat when there was fairly large-scale encounters going on. But the bitterness of the Civil War is another thing. And that deepened in December 1922, or November and December 1922. Was the Free State winning or losing? Now the fact is, if you look at it objectively, the Free State, or the Provisional Government, was winning the Civil War. But interestingly enough, the Provisional Government, and especially their soldiers, thought they were losing. Why was this? One second, and I have a quote for you. So Paddy O'Connor is a Dublin ex-active service unit IRA fighter. He's one of these men who's very loyal person to Michael Collins. He later on talked to Ernie O'Malley. Ernie O'Malley, incidentally, is the commander of the IRA, Anti-Treaty IRA Eastern Division. In theory, commands half of Ireland at this point. Later on in the 30s, Ernie O'Malley interviewed many people about the independence struggle, including the Civil War. What Paddy O'Connor told him was, we were losing, and you remember he's a pro-treaty soldier, a Free State soldier. We were losing the support of the people. Our men were war-weary, and the going was heavy for us. Our men had no grub, no uniforms, and no pay. So don't think all the idealism was on your side. The executions broke your morale, there's no doubt about that. So, in November 1922, the Free State brought in official executions. Now, there had been reprisals already happening. And actually, probably twice as many Republicans were killed in unofficial reprisals, in murders, basically, assassinations, as were killed in official executions. The number, by the way, I have this down at the bottom. The Republican number is 77. There were actually 81 executions, but 3 of them were armed robbers. Again, there's a breakdown of law and order happening here as well. Anyway, a moral as well as a military weapon. Now, so there's nearly twice as many killed in reprisals as are killed in official executions. But official executions, I would argue, have a kind of a terrorizing effect because the state puts into law that you were to die for opposition to the state. They pass a law that's often quoted as being the Public Safety Act. Now, a quick bit of legalese here. The Provisional Government had no right to enact any laws under the treaty. The Provisional Government was set up to enact the treaty. And what the so-called Public Safety Act was actually just a motion of the jaw. So technically, every execution in the Civil War was illegal, by strict legal standards. What happened was, in August 1923, at the end of the war, the Free State retrospectively legalised what they did by declaring an amnesty. It might appear that it was an amnesty for former guerrillas. In fact, it was an amnesty also for them. It legalised what they had done, and then when they had technically the legal power to do it, they enacted a new Public Safety Act, which also allowed for internment and execution. But under what's known as the Public Safety Act, possession of arms, aiding and abetting attacks on state forces was punishable by death. Death could be conferred by the signature of 2 army officers. Okay, you didn't even need the approval of the government. Now, The first executions were November 1917, 4 young men from Dublin, then 3 more in Dublin, and Erskine Childers. Erskine Childers had been secretary to the treaty delegation, and had been against the treaty. He was a former very high-ranking British officer, British intelligence, but later on was an Irish Republican. He was executed. In retaliation, now I stress this again, in retaliation for that, this is often said in reverse, but this is the way it was. Liam Lynch issued an order that all members of Parliament, all TDs who signed the murder bill, were to be shot on sight. He also, by the way, ordered the execution of judges, and he ordered the execution of newspaper editors as well. And there were actually a number of attempts to kill the editor of the Irish Independent, which Republicans were particularly against. But that didn't happen. The only assassination that happened in terms of TDs was Sean Hales. This is Sean Hales here on the left. Sean Hales, I mentioned at the very start, Sean Hales was a Republican, but his brother was in the Anti-Treaty IRA. Sean Hales was staying in Ormond Quay, again not very far from here. He was driving to the Dáil. I'm not sure if this is the actual day, but here he is driving on a horse-drawn cart anyway. He was shot dead. There are various versions of the assassination, I'm not going to go into that. But they assassinated the TD. Again, the assassination of a TD, it's only one man, but the moral effect of it is important. So it's a terror tactic. The same way the executions were terror tactics. The civil war is becoming basically an exercise in terror. Who can apply the more terror? Well, the government decided they would apply more terror. So they took, the following day, the day after Sean Hales was assassinated, they took the 4 leaders of the Anti-Treaty IRA in the forecourts back at the start of the Civil War. Now, there's Rory O'Connor, Dick Barrett, Joe McKelvey, and who am I missing? Liam Mellis. They had been captured before any emergency legislation had been passed. So even by the standard, I've talked already about the legalese, but even by the standards of the legislation, these were illegal executions. But they were shot the day after Sean Hales, in retaliation for Sean Hales. And in a lot of ways, this is a turning point in the Civil War, because the Free State side has shown that militarily they have the upper hand, they have more men, more guns, and so forth. But also, they're prepared to use as much terror as the other side. Both who can out-terrorize who, government can out-terrorize. This is what we see. In January, February 1922, there were executions outsourced, if you like, around the country. Kevin O'Higgins especially pushed for this. His idea was that if you had an execution in a county, it would overawe anti-treaty or irregular resistance in that county. There was an amnesty in February, and Republicans were given an opportunity to surrender. They didn't surrender. Executions were resumed in March. They actually continued right until the end of the Civil War. The executions are what Republicans remembered with most bitterness about the Civil War, because again, Todd Andrews wrote, what was done in hot blood, I could forgive, but what was done in cold blood like this, I could not forgive. Violence against civilians. So, there is a study of civil wars. It's called The Logic of Violence in Civil War. It's basically based on the Greek Civil War, which says that in civil wars, civilians suffer most. And what this argument found was that in a study of several civil wars, what happens is that civilians get murdered by a side in occupation of territory because they collaborated with the other side. Now, what's interesting about the Irish Civil War is that didn't happen. There's quite a lot of restraint, and actually, far fewer civilians were killed in the Civil War than killed in the War of Independence. Around 800 civilians were killed in the struggle against the British. We don't have an exact number, but around 200 roughly were killed in the Civil War by all forms. Around 200 people were deliberately killed as informers by the IRA in the War of Independence. I don't have the number, but a far smaller number were killed in the Civil War. So there was a reluctance actually to kill civilians on both sides. But I have some examples of civilians being killed. So there was a Republican arson campaign. This is, by the way, is Moore Hall. Maurice Moore was a senator. The Senate was set up in December 1922. Many of the senators, the Senate goes back to the Home Rule Bill. Initially it was envisaged as kind of a House of Lords. A lot of the members were former Unionists. They were big landowners. They were traditional targets for Republican animosity, let's say. So there was a campaign of arson against their houses, the big houses. 200 mansions or big houses were burned down in the Civil War. Also, houses of Free State officials, houses of the families of Free State soldiers were also burned down. There was destruction of civilian infrastructure. There was the destruction of railway lines, bridges, roads. This was very unpopular. Free State troops killed civilians. Generally, they killed them at checkpoints. I have just some examples just to give you an idea. This is from County Tipperary. A civilian, John Hogan, was shot dead by National-Irish troops who had allegedly been drinking in Nina, March 19, 1923. 16th of May, 1923. National Army Sergeant John Ryan shoots dead a civilian, Michael Candy, with a revolver in Littleton, North Tipperary. He's later charged with murder. 15th of August 1923, National Army soldiers opened fire on 3 men who failed to halt at a roadblock in Nina. They kill one James Taylor, former British Army and Free State Army soldier. 17th of August, Free State troops open fire in a civilian car at a checkpoint near Roscrea, killing civilian Susan Dooley. Unfortunately, these are sadly all too common events. At checkpoints, soldiers fire at people who they think are a threat to them. A lot of civilians are killed like that. Republicans, again, there is quite a bit of restraint actually, because the Republicans don't kill that many civilians in the Civil War. They shot a lot more in the War of Independence. But as a lot of civilians were killed by Republicans as they were on the run, especially as the Civil War is coming to an end. They were on the run, they had no food, they had no shelter. They would arrive at houses in the middle of the night, they'd demand food and shelter. Sometimes people, understandably perhaps, would resist them. And quite a lot of civilians would get shot. Now, there are a lot of very tragic cases. I have one here. 31st of March 1923, this is right at the end of the Civil War. An 80-year-old woman, Miss Fitzpatrick, shot dead at her home in Longford by Republicans who were looking for her son, a Free State Army officer. Same night, Ballybay, County Monaghan, another civilian, Owen McGuinness, pro-treaty supporter. They arrived at his house, they demanded food and shelter, there was some sort of scuffle and he was shot dead. Okay? So Free State troops generally tended to kill people at checkpoints. They opened fire in all directions kind of thing. Republicans, when they did kill civilians, tended to kill them when they raided their houses looking for food, looking for money and so forth. The very bitter end, I'm going to go through this as quickly as possible because many people will be aware of this. The most ugly episode perhaps of the Civil War is down in Kerry. A Knocknagoshel bomb, it's a booby trap bomb for National Army soldiers down in Kerry. 5 Free State soldiers, including 2 members of the Dublin Guard, the pro-treaty IRA basically, were killed, they were blown to bits. In reprisal for that, there were several reprisal massacres. At Ballyseedy Cross, 9 Republicans were taken from Tralee, which is near Tralee. 9 Republicans were taken from Ballymullen Jail in Tralee. They were beaten, they were taken to Ballyseedy Cross, they were tied around a landmine. The landmine was detonated. One of them was actually Stephen Fuller, who was later a Fianna Fáil TD, was blown clear. There were 2 more massacres. There was a massacre at Countess Bridge, Killarney. I forget the exact number, 3 or 4 anti-treaty fighters were killed there. At Countess Bridge, at Cartersveen rather, this is a memorial at Cartersveen. The same thing again. This time they shot them in the legs to make sure no one would get away, and it blew up, I think, 7 more anti-treaty prisoners. Okay, very grisly stuff. In Dublin, there's a mutual campaign of assassination. Very brief story about her. Mike McKenna, who's in the front row, has researched this. There was a pro-treaty politician, Seamus Doyle, an ex-TD, who was assassinated in December 1922. That was in reprisal for the executions. In reprisal for that, a man named Frank Lawler was abducted from his home, who was an anti-treaty fighter, but he was abducted from his home in Ranelagh. He was dumped out in Milltown, he was murdered. There were more killings in reprisal for that. At this point, they started to kill unarmed, off-duty Free State soldiers in Dublin, which they had not done before. So, again, more reprisals. A man named Bobby Bonfield, who had actually pulled the trigger and killed this guy, Seamus Doyle, he was spotted by Cosgrave. Cosgrave, remember, is the very head of the Free State. He was spotted by his bodyguard in Stephen's Green, and he was abducted and he was killed. He was dumped again out in Clondalkin. This is the kind of thing that was going on. IRA banned public entertainments. They banned cinemas, racing, meetings, etc. One IRA volunteer was killed trying to blow up the Carlton Cinema here on O'Connell Street. So the Civil War ended in a very vindictive, very bitter, and in many ways very kind of pointless violence. Clash Meek and other tragedies. Anti-treaty IRA, basically they're being hunted at this point. They're not so much fighting as running away. Clash Meek down in County Kerry is just kind of a symbol of this. It's a very evocative symbol. It was an anti-treaty column. It was trapped there on the coast. They took refuge in a cave. They were surrounded. Supposedly the leader, Lyons, who was the leader of this column, was given a rope to climb up on, and they cut the rope. Whatever happened, him and I think 2 other men were killed in a firefight. There was also a National Army officer killed. The rest were taken prisoner, but then they were executed afterwards, officially executed. But again, this shows the very bitterness of the Civil War at the very end. Now, this is a very important point which I want to make. There was also the other Civil War. The other Civil War is not pro-treaty against anti-treaty. It's not a military encounter. It's the state imposing its law on society, imposing its force, often in very brutal ways. What we have here is strikers. The post office went on strike in September 1922, at the height of the Civil War, at the crisis time actually for the Free State. They say girl telephonists shot by military. There were pickets here in Temple Bar, and the military shot at the pickets, and they shot it. Actually, it was a ricochet, but they shot in the knee a girl telephonist of the postal service. They complained about prices. The problem was that wages were going down. They wanted them to go up. But my point here is that state force was used to impose state power. Okay, again, the monopoly of force. This is what's happening. There was agrarian violence. Now, up in the border area in County Leitrim, what the National Army Intelligence says is the way the anti-treaty IRA was recruiting support is they were taking land of pro-treaty supporters and giving it to their own supporters. So this lay behind some Civil War violence as well, where people just taking land from each other. There was also a rent strike up in the North Midlands. There were still a substantial class of landlords, the old-style landlords, big landlords, and there was a rent strike all across the North Midlands. Okay, towards the end of the Civil War, the National Army, especially a part of it called the Special Infantry Corps, which was, I put there at the end, was deployed in spring 1923 to collect rent, to put down strikes. The biggest example is down in Waterford. There's a strike at a creamery, a very big strike. The problem is, again, there's an economic crisis. Employers want wages to go down, workers are trying to defend them. There was a very bitter strike in County Waterford, and the whole county was placed under martial law. This was actually after the ceasefire of the Civil War, the military war. But the Special Infantry Corps, which is a special part of the National Army, which is used basically for kind of public order, a little bit like the gendarme or the Guardia Civil, something like that. A particularly, by the way, particularly unpopular part, particularly badly trained and badly paid part of the National Army, were used to do things like to put down strikes, to collect rent. So again, Civil War is not just about pro and anti-treaty, it's also about the state imposing an order. And I think we have to be unromantic about this. This is what states do. They impose order by force. Maybe they impose it in more or less benign ways, but this is what states do. Okay, getting towards the end now. The end of the Civil War. The Anti-Treaty IRA is gravely, gravely weakened. In Dublin, for example, at the start, at the battle in Dublin in June, July 1922, there had been something in the region of 1,000 to 2,000 well-armed anti-treaty volunteers in Dublin. Now, by the end of the Civil War, there are fewer than 200 IRA, by National Army Intelligence estimate. There are fewer than 200 anti-treaty IRA volunteers left, and they have between them only 8 rifles. So they're in a very, very weak position. The problem is, how do you end the war? Now, Eamon de Valera by this point is basically screaming at Liam Lynch, we have to end this, we have to look for a political solution. Liam Lynch says, no, we tried this before, Colin Strictus, so we're going to go on to the bitter end. This is where Lynch gets his reputation as a fanatic. But Liam Lynch is killed in December, 10th of December 1927, 10th of April 1923, he's killed in County Tipperary. And Frank Aiken, who takes over, called a ceasefire, and then later on, on May 30th, issues a dump arms order. That's the end of the Civil War. Now, by this point, among the general population, there's a great war weariness. Most of the civilian population are sick to death of this. There are partisans of both sides, but this is actually a quote from a prospective Labour TD. He said, "The time for guns is over. Muzzle the guns. We've had enough of guns." So, there was an election right after. One point about this: the fact that there's an election at the end of the Civil War is kind of a remarkable thing. Some people have made the point it's not a particularly free election because most of the anti-treaty candidates were actually imprisoned. And their campaigners were not really openly allowed to campaign. And there were people shot by National Army troops during the campaign, some accidentally actually, but there is an election and they are allowed to participate, which by the standards of, say, for example, the Spanish Civil War, if you can imagine General Franco at the end of the Spanish Civil War allowing Spanish Republicans to participate in an election, there wasn't an election for another 40 years in Spain after the Spanish Civil War. So it does show a certain amount, again, of restraint in the Irish Civil War. So, pro-treaty, the new party, coming in now, it wins, but anti-treaty support actually rises. This is interesting. Anti-treaty support is bigger in 1923 at the end of the Civil War than it was at the start. Why this was, I can't rightly explain actually. Might be to do with the harshness of government policy, might be to do with because of the pact, the government, or the anti-treaty support was underestimated in 1922. Not exactly sure. But, and those are the figures there. There's strong evidence among civilians of neutrality. Now, first of all, nearly 250,000 people voted for people like the Farmers' Party, there in yellow, the Labour Party, Businessmen's Party, again former unionists mostly, and independents, okay? So a lot of people didn't want to take either side. They were really sick and tired of the Civil War. They were sick of instability, sick of fear. Ernie O'Malley, and the other very interesting thing is, this was the first election in Ireland with proportional representation, which we still have to this day. And a lot of transfers, very strangely, went across the treaty divide. Now, Ernie O'Malley wrote in his memoir, Ernie O'Malley, by the way, was captured in November 1923 here in Dublin. He had been the IRA commander of the Eastern Division, riddled with bullets, threatened with execution, wasn't executed probably because he was too badly injured to face execution. He was elected, while still in Mountjoy, due to transfers from Richard Mulcahy, who was the commander-in-chief of the National Army. And Ernie O'Malley in his memoirs has a good line. He says, perhaps it was at the people once said, they haven't much sense, the creatures. People felt sorry for them. I don't know. No. So, the military challenge to the treaty is over. Okay, I have a good quote here which illustrates how Republicans feel at the end of the Civil War. Maura Comerford, again, Cumann na Man, the Republican Women's Organisation, is solidly anti-treaty. Maura Comerford was arrested for the attempted kidnap of W.T. Cosgrave. She'd been attempted to kidnap and possibly kill W.T. Cosgrave during the Civil War. She was shot in the leg by a Free State soldier in prison. She was released in time for the 23 election. Now, with most of the anti-treaty activists and fighters, but also political activists imprisoned, the women basically campaigned for the anti-treatyites in this election. Now, what she says though is interesting. She said, their supporters in the United States get sent them a case of guns, okay? And they said they were the last thing we wanted to see. Sinn Féin was cleaning itself of its military reputation and trying to be political, which again, possibly is parallel to the present day actually. But by the end of the war, the anti-treaty defeat is not only military, they've also given up on the military option, okay? So, I think that's important in terms of, again, what I talked about. Not only that the Free State is stronger, but that the other side have accepted that to change things, they have to work within the system. And so, although there were people who wanted to continue the war, but basically, I think that's representative of the Republican position at the end of the Civil War. They were sick and tired, they could take no more, and they were going to go for political means. Now, the monopoly of legitimate force, as I talked about at the start, was effectively established. Okay, how many died? One of the strange things about the Civil War is nobody ever really wanted to bother counting how many died, but we do have a rough idea. So Cosgrave told W.T. Cosgrave, again, the head of the the Free State government by this point, said approximately 600 officers and men and volunteers were killed between 1916 and 1921. Now, this is I checked this against the last post, which a gentleman down the back has actually. The last post is the record of Republican dead. This is correct. About 600 were killed, 600 volunteers were killed from 1916 to 1921. Now, about 800 National Army officers, this is pro-treaty of course, were killed in the Civil War between January 1922 and April 1924. Now, if you look at the combat of the Civil War, this actually looks kind of high. You don't really see that many being killed. So I suspect this figure also includes deaths from illness, deaths from wounds, things like that, deaths from accidents. Roughly a third of National Army deaths were deaths by accidents because this was a very poorly trained army. There were a lot of very tragic cases. In Dublin, for example, where there were 70 pro-treaty soldiers killed, roughly, 20 of them were killed in accidents. So it's like 25–30%. And you see this around the country. Now, 25 to 30% are casualties. Now, the last post, again, this is the Republican, and the last post only records the anti-treaty deaths, of course. The last post lists 450 IRA deaths around. Now, this is probably an underestimate because they weren't in a position to be able to keep records. A lot of people who joined the IRA in like 1921 during the truce and served in the Civil War and were possibly killed in the early months of the Civil War were probably not counted, okay? But let's take that as right. That adds up to about 1,200. The civilian deaths are unknown exactly, but very, very roughly they're about 200. They might be a bit more than that, but they're 200 to 300, I would suggest. So you're looking at a rough total of 1,500 deaths. A few words about this. This is less than the War of Independence, but it's roughly the same as the War of Independence if you subtract the 6 counties of Northern Ireland. So roughly, although sometimes people talk about figures of 4,000 or 5,000, there's no way, okay? There's no way it's very much above 1,500. So it's roughly the same as the War of Independence. People often talk about what more were killed in the Civil War. I would suggest this has to do with people's feeling that the Civil War was a more bitter affair because it was between Irish nationalists. The figure I would say is not much higher than 1,500. Now in terms of international conflicts, there's a civil war in Finland between communists and anti-communists in 1918 to 19, where 20,000 are killed. And 3/4 of them died either by execution by the white anti-communist government or in imprisonment. So you see that a lot of the violence in Ireland is actually, although it's horrible and although it's very bitter, it's somewhat restrained. People don't go as far as they might have gone, on both sides actually. And there are also, there's conflict between German nationalists and Polish nationalists in Silesia, which is a province, but it's actually part of Poland now. At that time it was between Germany and Poland, where there were about 4,000 to 5,000 killed. So there are a lot of conflicts in Europe after the end of the First World War, of which the Irish Revolution is only one. And the death toll in the Irish Revolution is very much towards the lower end. Finally, to conclude, the consequences. This is a Cumann and L poster from 1923, The Shadow of the Gunmen. Keep it from your door. The pro-treaty argument, ever since, possibly in some respects until this day in Irish political culture, is they saved the Free State for democracy, they saved it for law and order. I would suggest we look at this unromantically, although it's certainly a good thing that democracy was maintained. There were anti-democrats on both sides. The reason I say this is because elements of the National Army tried a coup, planned a coup in 1924. They were arrested by people on their own side, by Richard Mulcahy, but there were anti-democratic elements also on the Free State side. Okay, also elements when Fianna Fáil came to power in 1932. Fianna Fáil, of course, emerged from the anti-treaty side to work within the Free State and to change the bits they didn't like about the treaty. There's no time to go into that today, but when Fianna Fáil did come to power by election in 1932, elements of the Irish Army, which of course had its roots in the Free State Army, did plan at notional level a coup in 1932, led by Hugo MacNeill, who was another son of Owen MacNeill. Owen MacNeill, I talked about at the start, minister, son killed on the other side. His son talked about, now they weren't serious plans really, but him and Owen McDuffie talked about a military coup in 1932. So I want to suggest there were militarists and anti-democrats on both sides. it was important that democracy was established. I'm wary about saying one side were Democrats, one side were dictators. I think that's far too simple. But what were the long-term consequences? Well, partition was confirmed. So what would have happened, we don't know. But the fact is, partition was absolutely confirmed. There's a culture of secrecy around state affairs. Now, there was a talk here on the Thursday about freedom of information. Freedom of information from that day to this is still very hard to get in Ireland. So I think certain authoritarian tendencies do date from the Civil War. Another one of those is that local government in Ireland is weaker than almost anywhere else in democratic Europe. And again, that dates back to the Civil War. There was far more authority given to local government under British rule, in fact. Now, I don't read too much into that, but that's a fact. And in the Civil War, after the Civil War, the government closed down and took away the authority. Well, first of all, they closed down a number of county councils, which were anti-treaty. And then, in the years afterwards, they took away much of their power and they gave it to county managers. Now, I don't want to sound partisan about this because Fianna Fáil also continued this policy after they came into power. But Ireland is one of the most centralised small countries in Europe. There were personal costs. Now, I want to conclude with just the personal cost of the Civil War. I've talked about how many died, but also the people who've been involved in this, who felt betrayed by their friends, who'd seen their friends killed by their friends. The Irish language term is Cullen Garrett's friends' war, which I think is interesting. A lot of them have very, very serious and very damaging psychological as well as physical consequences. Now, this is Joseph O'Connor. I quoted Joseph O'Connor about the treaty where he felt the Dáil had overstepped the mark, that IRA was upholding the Republic. Here's what he said after the Civil War. He said, "My nerves were completely gone. For the next 18 months, I had the awful experience of being afraid." And this is after he got out of jail. Oh, one more thing. The anti-treaty prisoners were not released until 1924. So the Free State government made good and sure that they won the Civil War. No, it wasn't the case they were let out in 1923. Now, Joseph O'Connor said when he was let out from prison, "My nerves were completely gone. For the next 18 months, I had the awful experience of being afraid, and it was my first acquaintance with fear. One day I was crossing Dame Street, where I took a seizure. When I came to, I was standing in front of a tram car with the driver jumping on the bell and bellowing at me. I just had time to get out of the way. Frequently, I had to ask my wife to accompany me home to the office from the office in the evening. At night, when asleep, if a motor car stopped within hearing distance, I would spring onto the floor." So this, I would suggest, was the personal cost of establishing the monopoly of legitimate force. Thank you. Normally I do this for someone else, but okay. So we have time for questions. So yeah, Rodney.
None of this would have happened. Actually, that was a lovely, good talk, really good talk. None of this would have happened if De Valera had gone with the will of the Dáil and the will of the people. There was a vote in the Dáil, I had figures up there, and there was an election fought pro and anti-treaty. The will of the people said, "We are going with the treaty, end of story." De Valera wouldn't accept it. So
sure, well,
all the destruction and heartache and mental turmoil the people went through was caused by one man, De Valera.
Okay, so we have short time. I want to say I completely disagree with that, unfortunately. Yeah. So I agree with I certainly agree with the ethics that the civil government should be above the military at all times. You can't just go around saying, "We don't like what you're doing, and so we're going to uphold the Republic no matter what the civilian government does." You can't do that. But De Valera, I stress, is not in control of the IRA. He's following the IRA. He's not leading the IRA. So I disagree. So I think, regardless of what De Valera did, I think it would have happened anyway. Actually, that's just my opinion. Yes, sir.
So, sorry, you mentioned Sean Cole, the two young men over there, Sean Cole and Alf Colley. I was glad they were mentioned because Alf Colley was best friends with my uncle. They joined the Fianna together, and he's buried in a very neglected grave up in Glasnevin with his grandmother, without a mention of what happened to him or that he took part in the fight and the War of Independence and the Civil War. There's not a mention of that in the grave now. The National Grave Association has been in touch with him to try and do something about it, but they're trying to get his family and that kind of thing, you know. But my uncle was to be with him that night with Sean Cole, and he had a date with my aunt. And just as anecdotal, on Parnell Square, it just struck me like my uncle was hauled into a Free State Army lorry after this, and my aunt happened to be his sister, was coming home from work, and caused such a scene that a crowd gathered and took my uncle back off the lorry, and he ended up emigrating to New York and lived the rest of his life in the Bronx. Married the woman he was dating that night, and my Irish American cousins always have told me that he never mentioned the Civil War again, or he never mentioned the Troubles again. So I just think it's probably a typical Civil War story.
Yeah, exactly. Both of those things are really common. A lot of Republicans left Ireland afterwards, and on both sides never talked about the Civil War. It wasn't something people ever wanted to remember. More questions? Yeah, go ahead.
At the beginning there you explained what the state is, how the foundation of the state. But they didn't die, they died for the nation. And the nation was the soul of Ireland. But the state was a man-made machine. It doesn't have a soul. But would you not agree the real tragedy wasn't just that Ireland was partitioned, but that Ulster was partitioned. And Ulster was the most Gaelic province. And we know that Cuchulainn was the greatest warrior in our history, but he didn't die for Ireland, he died for Ulster.
Okay, so I think that's a good illustration of the way Republicans were thinking though. Republicans, they're anti-treaty Republicans on the ground. We're not thinking in terms of, oh, we have a state, we have this and that. This is the way they looked at it. We're fighting for the Irish nation, for the freedom of Ireland. So I can't comment on that one way or the other. People believe that or they don't, but I think it does help to explain what people were doing. Yeah, more questions? Yeah.
Sorry, just Sean Hale's killing.
Yeah.
Was saying as this terrible attack on democracy because he hated them. The other he hated, like previous to that, Seamus Devons, who was one of the 6 IRA captures, 6 Republicans captured, and shot out of a hand.
Yeah, very
so,
close.
So shooting TDs wasn't the yours, it was just shooting your TDs.
Yeah, well, again, what I've tried to argue tonight is that when trying to reduce the Civil War to morality doesn't really do it in terms of explanation. So, unfortunately, you have to look at it unromantically. This is a struggle for power. You know, it happened because of this bid over the treaty. But what's going on is a very brutal struggle for power, and terrible things were done on both sides. I don't think you can choose one side more virtuous than the other in terms of the conduct of the Civil War. Yeah, tell me back.
Would you consider something I've always thought in terms of the Civil War, effectively as a counter-revolution, in the sense that all of your reactionary, conservative, right-wing elements in Irish society, the Catholic Church, the big business, big farmers, the editors the owners of all the newspapers, they all wrote 100% in behind pro-treaty rights. And while I'm not saying there was a great class consciousness among people on the Republican side, there was definitely a class consciousness on the right, the kind of conservative elements of society, and they were making damn sure that there was no concept ever of having any kind of progressive elements controlling our society. And I think the whole idea that you were saying about the fact that the National Army was used quite during the Civil War to put down strikes, etc., by working people during the Civil War, and I think emphasises that point. And I think it's no coincidence that the party that led the pro-treaty side, Fine Gael, have throughout our history almost certainly the most conservative aspect of our society, and have represented the most conservative aspect of our society ever since.
So there's some element of truth in that. So two things. Certainly, one of the things that Republicans did after the Civil War, anti-treaty Republicans, was they tried to work out what it had all been about. And one of their answers was this, that it had been a counter-revolution. And that, and they moved in a kind of left-wing direction. They had the Republican Congress in the 30s who argued exactly this. There's certainly some truth in it. Certainly, the money classes, the property classes were on the side of the treaty. If it's true it's a counter-revolution, I prefer the term a thermidor. The thermidor is an expression from the French Revolution. The thermidor was the month when the Robespierre and the Jacobins were overthrown. The most radical revolutionaries were overthrown by the more moderate, the Directory. The reason I prefer that term is because the pro-treatyites don't see themselves as counter-revolutionaries. They see themselves, and they actually say this, they talk about this in 1923, as completing the nationalist revolution. If they'd been counter-revolutionaries, they would have been talking about hoisting the Union Jack. They would have been talking about entering the Commonwealth. They would have been talking about giving land back to the landlords. They're talking about the opposite of those things. They're certainly not radicals, but they did enact another Land Act in 1923 at the end of the Civil War. I didn't have time to talk about this today, but they tried to, from their point of view, they were conservatives for sure, but they saw themselves as trying to complete the nationalist revolution. Now, people might say that they were reactionaries, and I certainly can understand people taking that point of view. That's certainly how Republicans saw it. I'd be a little bit wary of describing kind of motives to people, though, you know, in that way, personally. Yeah, one of your questions? Yeah.
Just one thing, I can remember many years ago reading a history book, I don't remember who wrote it, but I mean, simplicity, as you pointed out, the chapter on the Civil War was titled Devil Era. Just to mention that, because it amused me at the time, but I think that's a wonderfully nuanced and balanced talk that you have given, and a wonderful compliment to you for that.
Gentlemen in the back, just can you let me know when time's up, by the way?
Sorry.
Thanks.
Sorry, can I just, you mentioned Frank Lawler, and just when I heard Frank Lawler, I just happened to know something about him, so I'd also like to share the information with the others here. Frank Lawler was a young man, 30 years of age, and he lived at Rugby Road in Guerrilla, in a very middle-class family. And he was found dead on the 28th of December 1922 at Lambert's Lane on Churchdown. Now Lambert's Lane is Churchdown, it's just at the very end, of the very top of Orwell Road, before you come to Milltown Golf Club, which is on both sides of the road. And he was on the left-hand side. When he was shot, he was taken out of the house and he was shot at Orwell Bridge and taken up and dumped at that spot. A young lad was found the next day at 6:30 a.m. the following morning in a pool of blood, and he had been shot through the right temple. He was smartly dressed in a grey suit, grey cardigan jacket, and was wearing black boots, but had no hat or overcoat. From his general appearance, it is thought that he had spent the evening indoors because there were no mud stains on his boots or his trousers. And very briefly, after the discovery of the body, a large crowd of people congregated in the vicinity. Shortly after 9, the body was removed to Dundrum by the Rathmines ambulance, and on the instructions of Sergeant Austin O'Toole and the Civic Guards, was placed on the premises of a Mr. Clark in Dundrum, where an inquest was held later. Yesterday afternoon, the body was identified by Mr. Lawler's 3 brothers. Interviewed by the Irish Times rep, Mr. Lawler, Mr. Lambert, the owner of the land, stated that although he had arrived home about midnight and remained in the kitchen until early in the morning, but heard no reports or revolver shots. As a rule, shots fired in Dublin streets were heard quite often. So it is now known that he was shot at Orwell Bridge and dumped up there. I got that information from my own father, because he had actually he was Frank Lawler's OC, and he knew that. But and the strange thing, that plaque which he put up on the side of the road was vandalised, and it was found by extension by a member of the Russian embassy.
Oh, that's true.
And I spoke to that man at the Russian embassy out in Rome at one time. I just happened to mention this thing, and he said, I have the pieces of that inside in the embassy. At least I had when I was attached to the embassy in Dublin. So the World War II, and just mention one other thing. There was a man, I'm going to be very brief. There was a man by the name, never known, this man by the name of Joseph Bergen from Mount Ratton, County Laois, joined the Free State Army in 1922 to be head of the Republican leadership for to bring out information. Unfortunately, he was found out and had this most terrible death, where his head was bashed off the cobbles in the station, the barracks down below Newbridge, and he was thrown into the canal, and that was the end of Joseph Bergen.
Yeah,
but unfortunately, the guy who did it was sent off to the Argentine to hide out until the things died down.
Yeah, and this is the cost of civil war. Just on that, I have a personal connection actually to that story, because that's near where I grew up, that monument to Frank Lawler. What's interesting from my point of view in that is my father, who's here today, would always say that this was a man who was killed in the War of Independence, fighting the Black and Tans. So eventually I looked at it and it said 1922, and said he was actually killed in the Civil War. But I think that's quite illustrative of how we wanted to forget this. Nobody ever wanted to remember that Irishmen killed Irishmen. I think it's kind of illustrative.
Seamus Fitzpatrick is the man who put the monument back up on Orwell Road.
I think we have time for one last question.
One last
One last question, yeah. Anyone?
I have a question then.
But no, there's a man over here. You can ask me afterwards.
It's great to see it's not being very being full. The two slides on the vote in the two elections. Where did the Home Rule Party vote go?
Mm-hmm. The Home Rule, okay, so the Home Rule Party basically it's a secret ballot obviously, but largely it went to pro-treaty candidates, but there were also some independents. For example, Alfie Byrne, who'd been a long time basically Home Rule Party hack in the centre of Dublin, he'd been like a parish pump politician in the centre of Dublin. There were quite a few candidates like him elected, and there were more elected in 1923. The Home Rule vote didn't completely go away, but they tended to be independents, and then in later years, in the 20s and 30s, they tended to merge into Cumann and Nail. There were also various other parties. There was a thing called the National Centre Party and stuff like that. Basically, as Cumann and Nail and Fine Gael tended to pick them up later on. But they still existed, certainly at the time. Fionnuala, I think we're out of time there.
I think that's about it, Jim.
Okay, so I'd just like to thank everyone else for coming. Just a few quick announcements. Number one, we have our last lecture. We have our last lecture next week, which is Brian Hanley on commemoration and the memory of the Irish Revolution. Okay. The second thing I want to say is my own book, Peace After the Final Battle, will be out at the end of March. All good bookshops. Okay. You can also read things that I write on the irishstory.com website, and you can listen to them at the Near FM History Show. Which, Cathal, what's the address there?
nearfm.ie.
Nearfm.ie. Look up the History Show. Okay. And with that, donations are, as always, are appreciated. I'm sure the donation thing is outside. Okay. Thank you very much for coming.